In the late 70s, the Briley Brothers rocked the US city of Richmond with a string of vicious murders.
The level of violence was horrifying.
Men, women, and children would lose their lives seemingly at random.
This was just not murder. This was overkill.
The siblings were a brutal gang.
The family that slayed together stayed together.
They were targeting weak and vulnerable people like a snake would target a mouse.
So cunning that even death row couldn't hold them.
It was supposed to be escape-proof.
The strongest maximum security that we had in Virginia.
But was murder in their DNA? Were these blood brothers born to kill?
You know, they hadn't seen carnage like this since probably the Civil War.
On I-95, WXGI, Richmond, Virginia. Broadcasting at 701 German School Road in Richmond. WXGI.
In 1979, Richmond would be rocked by the disappearance of popular local country music DJ Johnny Gallagher.
Well, when I was born, Johnny G was there. He was my dad's probably best friend. They just grew up playing music together. They hung together kind of like Batman and Robin used to, you know.
He was like our uncle, and he was a radio disc jockey. He was originally from Tennessee. It's where he grew up, and that's why he was known as Johnny G from Tennessee. He used to help me with my homework, and it was quite interesting at times.
He was there for every Christmas. Help us put the Christmas trees up, and every Sunday there eating dinner, watching football games, many Super Bowls we watched together. He was just a very good person.
On the 14th of September, the bass-playing DJ mysteriously vanished.
He had been playing at a night spot down on a main thoroughfare going out of the city to the south called Jefferson Davis Highway.
Johnny didn't smoke cigarettes in a smoke-filled bar room, you know. He wanted to go get some fresh air. So he went outside to get some fresh air and never come back in. Some of the people playing music with him and the owners and stuff, they knew my dad was a policeman, and so they called Dad, and Dad knew something was automatically wrong.
Detective Jim Gourdet was assigned the case.
Johnny G worked for WXGI radio station, which was a country station, and he played in the country bands and over on the weekends and so forth. And one of them was a log cabin restaurant nightclub down on Jefferson Davis Highway, and he was playing down there that night.
Johnny G's disappearance was out of character.
And they started looking around, trying to figure out what happened. Did he just up and leave, or what happened? They really didn't know at the time, you know.
Fearing he'd been abducted, a search began.
His car was found that Saturday evening.
The car was discovered less than a mile from Richmond's Janes River. But would it hold the key to Gallagher's whereabouts?
We responded to where the car was found, and we thought maybe he was in the trunk. We popped the trunk and he wasn't in there. So then we processed the car, and we found a fingerprint behind the door panel. I guess they were looking for speakers or whatever, and they did take a CB radio and an antenna. Apparently they thought they could get something out of the car.
Although Johnny G was nowhere to be found, it was clear he'd been the victim of some sort of crime. That year, he wouldn't be alone. Richmond was in the middle of an unprecedented, brutal crime spree.
Oh, very out of the ordinary. Very out of the ordinary. You know, they hadn't seen carnage like this since probably the Civil War.
Robbery, rape, murder. No one seemed safe.
The type of ferocity, violence, atrocity was just something that Richmond had not experienced. Never before, never since.
The only common factor was that the victims were vulnerable.
They were highly predatory. They weren't targeting a group of guys who may have had a weapon. No, they were targeting weak and vulnerable people like a snake would target a mouse.
Young, old, good neighborhood or bad, there was no hiding place.
And that's what scared people, that, they didn't know what was going on. And they were scared. And the brutality of it.
This just erupted the city, into fear.
The range of crimes meant that no one was sure if they were connected. But on the 22nd of October, police would be called to a shocking scene that would tie all the attacks together. In Barton Avenue, on the city's north side, detectives were alerted to something strange at the home of the Wilkerson family.
We get a call that this couple had not been seen, that something suspicious about the house that neighbors were concerned about.
2301 Barton Avenue. It's right here. Right there's their apartment.
The front door was open and went in, and that was the young son laying on the sofa. The female victim, who was about 8 months pregnant, laying on the floor, and her live-in boyfriend.
That was bad. As soon as you got in the house, blood everywhere, tracked. They had 2 Doberman Pinscher puppies, and they were just running through the blood and everything. It was just a mess. Harvey Wilkerson and Judith Barton was tied up with duct tape behind them, and both shot.
The thing that strikes me about that crime scene, it looks like the little boy was just laying on the sofa with his head laying on the sofa looking towards the TV like he was just laying there watching television.
But 5-year-old Harvey Wilkerson was not watching TV. He'd been shot through the head at point-blank range. His pregnant mother had been assaulted in front of him.
Very brutal, very sadistic.
A feared local gang had been spotted running from the scene 3 days earlier. Linwood, James, and Anthony Briley would become prime suspects in the triple murder. But as police moved in to arrest the gang, they could never have imagined the bloody rampage they were about to uncover. In 1979, Richmond police discovered a bloody triple murder. The Wilkerson family had been violated and executed in their home, and suspicion fell on a group of brothers with a fearsome reputation. As police moved in to make an arrest, Linwood Briley and gang member Duncan Meekins were in a car and on the move.
We were following them.
Linwood was driving. Meekins and Linwood's dad was in the car.
What happened next illustrated just how street smart the gang were.
Every time we would make a conversation that they're turning right, they would turn left.
We didn't know what was going on.
And we'd say they're turning left because they were giving the signal, they would turn right.
Yeah, we were just kind of fluctuating all over because we didn't know where they were going or what they were going to do.
With the Brileys leading their trackers a merry dance, police decided to force the situation.
Finally, we just had enough, and I said, just put them into a pole. So they ran them into a telephone pole. That's when we found a scanner and realized that's how they were listening to what we were doing.
The Briley brothers and Duncan Meekins were taken into custody, and detectives got their first look at the gang suspected of the brutal murder of man, woman, and child.
They were very offensive. They didn't think we had anything on them, and they weren't going to tell you anything.
Linwood, he was calculated and cold.
And he was just looking all over the place and sort of ignoring me, you know.
Linwood Briley was apparently fearless.
I said, you know, this is serious. You could get the electric chair. He threw up his arms and said, take it like a man.
So just who were this family, seemingly capable of violent rape and cold-blooded murder?
The Brileys all lived over on the east side of the city to the north, called Highland Park.
The area that the Brileys grew up in was, row houses, middle-income class houses, certainly not anything to be ashamed of.
And the only bad part was the Brileys. That's where the Brileys lived with their mother and father. The mother and father were good people.
Their mother was a lovely lady. You would never have attributed her to bringing up three boys that turned out as bad as these three people.
I knew some people that went to school with them that said they were bullies in school. They said they liked to bully around and have their way.
The young Brileys also had a telling hobby.
They liked pets, but they liked really dangerous pets.
They had a boa constrictor and they had some tarantulas.
So they liked, they had poisonous things.
Piranhas and snakes and things like that. They were clearly predators, and they enjoyed feeding live mice to the snakes and watching. So there is significance in the delight they would take of watching a predator go after its prey.
It seemed to a certain point that their family life was unconventional, normal. And then when they reached their teenage years, something changed, and there seemed to be, I don't know, there certainly seemed to be a lack of empathy.
That lack of empathy would be illustrated by the mysterious death of the Brileys' elderly neighbor.
Ole Christian. She lived in this house here, 19.
Orlean Christian had been hanging out washing in her yard when she'd suddenly dropped dead.
At first, it was more or less a natural death because she had heart problems, until some of the family noticed a spot on her. And further, we found out she'd been shot.
A Richmond detective began investigating the motiveless murder.
Being the sharp investigator that he was, took an 8-foot 2x4, and he cut the 2x4 off to the height of the victim. And then, using the autopsy report, drilled a hole through this 2x4, showing the direction that the projectile came from. And then he stood in the backyard where the victim was, and he turned this 2x4 around until he eventually, it showed that it would possibly have come from Linwood Briley's rooftop.
When the murder weapon was found in 16-year-old Linwood's house, his lack of remorse for the death of the elderly neighbor was shocking.
His response, according to the documents, was, well, she was going to die anyway. Stunning. Absolutely stunning.
You can clearly see this attitude starting as a teenager, that he has no regard for human life, and that she was just for target practice.
Sentenced to a year in a juvenile facility, Linwood would become a role model for his younger brothers, James and Anthony.
I think everybody saw just how deviant he was, how extreme he was, what he's capable of. And the other two brothers just seemed to chime in and go along with that.
He would have probably bragged to them, he would have probably strutted about, because that was his personality. And so for them, they probably would have thought, well, you know, wow, this is really a bold thing to do. So he's certainly modeling for them, you know, what it takes to be a man.
I don't think there's any question that Linwood was the leader, and James was a follower, and Anthony, to a lesser degree, was a follower too. Linwood was very cold, very calculating, very methodical, and James was a little bit more emotional, but he wasn't as cerebral. Certainly he didn't have the intelligence that his brother did, Linwood did, but he certainly had the arrogance.
At 16, James would follow in his brother's footsteps.
James Briley was arrested for robbery and attempted murder of a police officer.
James Briley had robbed a store and had escaped from the robbery and trying to make a getaway, and a police officer who was on duty close by responded and picked up James Briley and was chasing him.
Detective Cecil Glunt ran after him, and he shot at Glunt, and then Glunt returned fire and hit him, so he was wounded.
As the brothers grew older, they grew tougher.
You just start to see these glimmers, like James and Linwood's father would sleep with a lock on his door at night.
He padlocked his own bedroom at night because he feared that they might do something to them. That's very, very rare. Most parents feel that they have control over their kids. Even if their kids are acting out in very aggressive and violent ways, they usually don't feel personally threatened by them. Briley's father did. I think that speaks volumes just to how deviant the three brothers were.
Now, years later, with the Brileys in custody for the sickening murder of the Wilkerson family, police were about to discover the shocking truth about just how depraved the brothers had become. With Linwood before him in the interview room, Detective Jim Gourdet realized the Brileys might be responsible for more than just the triple murder at Barton Avenue.
And I had Johnny G, or Johnny Gallagher, the disc jockey case, and items were taken from him. One of them was a turquoise ring. I noticed Linwood was wearing a ring, turquoise ring like was described. So I took it off and I called Leroy Morgan, the detective.
He had this ring on his finger, and my dad seen it and said,
That's Johnny's
ring.
That's
and
Johnny's
that's Johnny's watch.
And that's how they linked
And that's
the
how
Brileys
got him
to
caught.
Johnny's murder.
Despite Linwood being caught wearing Johnny G's jewelry, the police had little evidence to tie the three Briley brothers to either the DJ's abduction or the bloodbath at Barton Avenue. However, a fourth member of the gang might provide the key. Duncan Meekins was just 16 years old and was a neighbor, not family.
He came from a very well-grounded background as far as I could tell. He was a good student, or a decent student, active in the church, and had been an altar boy.
Meekins lived next door to the Brileys, and they were idols to him, basically. You know, he thought they were, you know, big, tough people, and he wanted to get involved, so they kind of took him under their wing.
Prosecutors decided to attempt a deal with Duncan Meekins, his evidence in return for his life.
Meekins was offered a deal, and sometimes when there are juveniles involved, they figure that they won't get the chair. So he started talking.
What Meekins would reveal would leave the people of Richmond stunned.
When this broke, I just thought, holy moly. Well, that's not what I thought. You know what I thought.
The Briley gang had been on a 7-month violent spree that had caused devastation all over the city.
The level of violence was horrifying. When all the details became known, just horrifying. They were just bad.
One of the first to die was elderly babysitter Mary Gowan, resident of a well-to-do Richmond neighborhood.
We're going to Mary Gowan, 76-year-old woman. She lives at upscale apartments. No crime ever occurs there. She had been babysitting over in the north part of Richmond at her daughter's house.
The Brileys had seen this elderly lady leave from her babysitting job, followed her all the way through the city of Richmond out to her apartment.
I don't think she even had a chance to yell because probably somebody would have heard her. She probably would have parked here. Now 51 is over there in that corner. That's it right there.
They abducted her, drug her into the stairwell, took turns raping her, and then shot her in the head and left her for dead. Well, just a vicious, horrific type crime. No rhyme or reason, didn't know the victim, just picked her at random.
Mary was just a wonderful lady, loved her grandkids, loved life.
So that was the beginning of it.
Next to die would be a 17-year-old that Linwood Briley suspected was casing his car.
Christopher Phillips. That was another sad case. It was my case, and I didn't have anything on it. They thought that he was looking in her car, 17-year-old boy. So they take him, drag him into the backyard, hold him down, he's yelling, take a cinder block and smash his head.
It seems that the Briley brothers were getting a taste for murder.
If they hadn't enjoyed it, they wouldn't have kept doing it. And I think that's what we see with some of these is some people think about committing murder, and when they find out, you know, not only is it tough, but getting rid of a body is difficult. In their case, they didn't really care. They didn't have any of that stuff. And there was some fun involved in it. It felt powerful to them. It felt like they were in charge, and they could make people do what they wanted, and there were really no consequences for them.
And the Brileys' violent rampage wasn't over yet. Their brutality was about to escalate to new, unthinkable levels. In 1979, the Briley brothers, Linwood, James and Anthony, along with their accomplice, 16-year-old Duncan Meekins, had terrorized the city of Richmond with a series of vicious robberies, rapes and murders. In custody, Meekins would reveal the horrific details of their violent rampage, including the answer to the riddle of DJ Johnny G's disappearance.
They rode around looking for people to rob and whatever. And if they seen somebody, that's when they done it. I mean, it wasn't pre-planned. They just, if they saw somebody walking here, they'd abduct them or whatever, you know.
This time, Johnny G would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meekins related how the gang had gone looking for someone to mug and had hidden in the bushes by the bar where the DJ was performing and lain in wait for a victim. At that point, he'd stepped out for air.
They broke into his Lincoln Mark IV, and they caught him when they were going across the parking lot. And
they abducted him, took his car keys, and put him in the trunk of his own car.
With Johnny G in the boot, the Brileys took his car to an abandoned paper mill on an island in the river.
Drove to the back by the river.
They knocked him in the head.
They did.
And carried him down to the river and shot him and threw him in the river. 3 days in a row, we were down there trying to find him, but we couldn't find him. He had got hung up under the water in some logs, and it took almost a week for him to surface up. Yeah, it was bad. And it still hurts me to this day, 30 years later. I just don't know how anybody could do something like that.
If the Briley brothers were killing or stealing to gain something as their primary motive, that's at least understandable. But it seems to me, as I look at this, that their main motivation was just to kill and destroy, where robbery was actually secondary. They functioned like a street gang that had gone amok.
Just 2 weeks after the murder of Johnny G, the Briley gang were on the prowl again. 62-year-old nurse Mary Wilfong had been returning to her home in a safe suburban neighborhood.
We're going to go by Mary Wilfong. I haven't been up here in a long time. They apparently saw her walking into the apartment or something and took out a baseball bat and smashed her head right in front of her house. Then they went in the house and ransacked it, and she was left on the sidewalk to die, and she did.
And the Brileys' reign of terror wasn't over yet. As they continued to escape justice, the brothers became bolder and more cruel.
I don't think the Brileys were out of control so much as feeling as if they were invincible and immune to arrest. They could have easily stopped doing it, but didn't want to because there were no consequences.
In October, the Briley gang would commit a crime, the brutality of which no one would ever forget.
We had a call to 5th Avenue, an elderly couple, and they hadn't been seen or heard from in several days.
Mrs. Page, she was partially paralyzed, so she didn't get around much. Mr. Gardner stayed there and paid rent to room there.
Arriving at the property, investigators were met by a gruesome scene.
The thing that struck me as soon as I walked in the door is that you looked up the stairwell, and the whole wall going up the stairwell and the steps were just covered in blood, all the way up.
59-year-old Charles Garner was discovered in the kitchen.
You never forget the smell of death. And when I walked into that kitchen, it was just rampant. I mean, you could just smell it, you knew it, and I've never forgotten it.
The level of violence inflicted on Garner was shocking. He'd been brutally attacked with a bat.
You know, the poor guy was no harm to anybody, but, you know, they beat him, and it was just the idea, you know, let me do this, let me do that.
And the horror continued, upstairs in the bedroom.
Every wall in that room was covered with blood. I mean, it would look like a slaughterhouse, basically.
79-year-old Blanche Page was discovered in bed.
Here's this poor white female laying in bed like she's asleep, but she's been beat to death with a baseball bat.
They didn't just hit her, they kept beating her. I don't care how long you've been a policeman, that's hard to see and take, because what somebody can do to a human body is just unbelievable.
This was just not murder. This was overkill.
These individuals like this to some degree. It gave them some sense of superiority, some sense of recognition to themselves that they could do anything. They weren't afraid of anybody or anything. There's nothing that would inhibit them. The police, society, rules, none of that applied to the Briley brothers.
Nothing illustrated the brothers' departure from morality more than the bloodbath at Barton Avenue, as Duncan Meakin's sickening account revealed. On the morning of October the 19th, James Briley had promised a parole judge he could be trusted to stay out of trouble. By the evening, he had other plans.
They had smoked some marijuana, they had drank some liquor, and they left their home and headed over to Barton Avenue, which was just a few blocks away from where they lived.
Unlike most of their previous victims, Harvey Wilkerson was an acquaintance of the gang.
Apparently, the Brileys and Meakins came down here with intent to rob them, and Wilkerson saw them coming and he got scared and locked the door, but then when they came up to the door, he was afraid that they would break in and cause them harm, so he let them in.
What happened next would shock even the most hardened of investigators.
When they got in there, they overpowered them and tied their hands up with duct tape behind them.
And then after that was done, they killed him. So they didn't kill the man first and then rape and sodomize the woman. They did it all in his presence and then killed him, which was a very, just show you how sick and mean and low life these people really were. And that's the only way to describe them. They were just, they weren't fit to be called humans as far as I'm concerned.
The Briley gang's 7-month spree had cost the lives of at least 10 victims. In return for his testimony, 16-year-old Duncan Meakins escaped the death penalty and received a life sentence, as did youngest brother Anthony Briley. But Linwood and James would both be sentenced to Virginia's electric chair.
James had no reaction when the sentence was brought down. I never got the sense that he was remorseful at all for anything that had happened.
Linwood had his head down, no emotion.
I remember he's saying, something to the effect, Mama, don't worry about this. This doesn't happen right away. I just thought, holy smokes. It was just a matter-of-fact voice, as if you'd gone and gotten a pack of cigarettes, from the grocery store. Amazing.
It seemed the threat of execution meant little to the Briley brothers. Deborah Wyatt would represent Linwood in his appeals against the death sentence and encountered a bright and charming individual.
I found him to be not an unenjoyable person to be around. I have had clients that I don't think I could have had a very long conversation with. He was not one of those. He was a nice-looking man. He was a well-spoken man, friendly, calm, with a sense of humor. It was hard to believe that he was the kind of person who would have done these crimes.
But despite appearances, Linwood and James had taken all their cunning and ruthlessness with them to death row.
Linwood had a kind of magnetism to him. They wanted to please him, even the guards. And then people were scared of James.
The Brileys managed to exert their strength and their sense of power even in prison.
The two of them basically seemed to operate the same way that they did when they were out.
They wanted to be known and feared while they were in the penitentiary.
They became kind of gang leaders there, and even the guards were cowed by them.
James and Linwood had a drug business. Prison guards would bring the drugs in to death row, and representatives in the prison would sell it, and James and Linwood would make a certain amount of money.
But bossing the prison wouldn't be enough for Linwood and James Briley. In 1984, Their brash scheming would reach unbelievable heights as they set out to prove that not even death row could hold them.
If you wrote that in some Pulp Fiction detective story, nobody'd ever believe it. What happened?
In 1979, Richmond, Virginia had been terrorized by the Briley Brothers. By 1984, with Linwood and James locked up on death row, the public had begun to relax. Little did they know that the brothers were about to do the unthinkable and spread panic through the city all over again.
They managed to plan and make one of the biggest prison breaks in United States history.
The Briley Brothers would take on Mecklenburg Correctional Center, held up as a model of modern prison design.
That was the strongest maximum security that we had in Virginia.
All these different gates going in and out. I guess in a zoo you have to do that with ferocious animals. You have all these different gates and nothing's open at the same time.
It was supposed to be escape-proof because everything was computerized.
Linwood and James, however, had other ideas.
They put together, with the help of some other inmates, a very sophisticated plan.
And on May the 31st, 1984, they would put that plan into action. The inmates had haircuts and shaved their beards. Then James Briley tricked an officer into opening the guardroom, and convict Earl Planton rushed to the control panel and opened all cell doors.
They overpowered some guards and took their uniforms.
Disguised as officers and armed with homemade knives, they overpowered any guards that entered the block.
At one point, they did want to kill one of the prison guards, and someone else stepped in and wouldn't let them do it. So these were very cruel young men who really had no regard for human life at all and would kill regardless. It didn't matter if there was a purpose to it or not, they just would.
Then Linwood, James, and 4 other inmates began an audacious ruse. First, they forced a guard to call for emergency transport to be brought to the gate.
They said that they had discovered a homemade bomb, and they asked for a van.
The group disguised themselves further still.
They actually had riot gear, helmets and stuff, so you couldn't actually see who they were.
And then made their move on foot across the compound.
They covered one of the TVs that the men watched in the day room with a blanket, and then as some of the men were carrying it out to the van, they would spray it with a fire extinguisher so that it looked like, this was a serious matter here.
Shouting that they had a live bomb that needed to be removed quickly, the gang demanded the guards break convention and open both gates at once. The guards complied.
They carried it into the van, and they drove through the gates and just kept driving.
By 11 p.m., the Briley brothers and 4 conspirators were gone.
I remember very clearly as if it were this morning. And when they said the Briley Brothers, I just thought, whoa. Just whoa.
The news that the Briley brothers were free terrified their hometown.
Everybody in Richmond became concerned again about them being on the loose.
While a massive manhunt was launched, people began to protect themselves against a revenge attack.
When people have committed these kinds of acts, you know that they're going to probably want to blame their incarceration and the fact that they're facing the death sentence on someone who has been involved in the case.
The level of fear escalated as sightings were reported nationwide.
We had to put protective officers around the judge's home, around some of the witnesses' homes.
All 4 of the Briley's co-conspirators were recaptured. But Linwood and James remained on the loose.
We went down to the police station and they issued us weapons. Somebody said, "What are you doing carrying a weapon?" And I said, "Well, it's not to do anything to anybody. It's to keep them from doing something to me, because there's no way in the world I was going to let them get their hands on me."
Finally, 19 days after their escape, a wiretap on the Brileys' uncle led searches to a garage in Philadelphia, where Linwood and James were discovered barbecuing chicken in the alley. Known as Lucky and Slim, they'd been doing odd jobs and befriending neighbours. James was Slim, Linwood was Lucky.
Linwood and James were the last ones to be caught, and they were just kind of hiding in plain sight, which once again shows, a kind of interesting intelligence there.
But neither Linwood nor James would be lucky again. The escape would be their last taste of freedom, and both of their executions would be planned for within a year.
I, of course, chose to escape because I'm innocent, and if you're innocent, I believe that you're supposed to be free.
Together, the three Briley brothers had terrorized a city and taken the lives of at least 11 men, women, and children. But what had turned them into cold-blooded murderers? Were Linwood, James, and Anthony Briley born to kill?
I think the fact that one of them killed as an adolescent with such a callous disregard for the victim indicates the possibility of what we call a fledgling psychopath. So he might be the one, if any of them was born to kill, it would have been him. The others, we really can't say.
The question arises as to whether each of these three brothers individually would have acted alone without the support, let's say, of the other brothers. I'm not sure. Linwood would have, the one who killed the elderly neighbor. He probably would have behaved in very, very deviant ways on his own. I'm not so sure about the other brothers. Possibly they would have, but they certainly gained a degree of support and a sense of belonging to the gang itself.
A lot of people within families, they start a business or something like that. They become rich. These guys became powerful and dangerous, and that was important. It was like a drug, better than sex, better than real drugs. It was just almost essential for them.
I don't think people are born bad. The Lord wouldn't want people to be born bad. I think you just hit the wrong road.
5 years after their brutal killing spree, Linwood and James Briley would pay the ultimate price for their crimes.
I went to Linwood Briley's execution. Linwood Briley, as brutal killer as he was a coward. And they had to sedate him and actually pick him up by his belt and walk him to the electric chair. He didn't go voluntarily. He was like a whip dog. And they put him in the electric chair and gave him exactly what he deserved. And I believe in a God and a heaven and a hell, and there's no question in my mind that Mr. Briley and James both are right where they deserve to be.
You don't make light of anybody getting the death penalty, But, they deserved it, they got it. I'm happy.
I'm sorry for their family, what their family had to go through, and I'm sorry for our family and what we had to go through.
The Briley brothers would leave a dark, indelible mark on the history and people of Richmond.
The family that slayed together stayed together.
Yeah.
May they all rot in hell.